any of this before. So the Wage and Employment Dynamics project has been several years in gestation. It came back partly through some discussions a few years ago, thinking that let's imagine that if we knew a person's hourly pay, structure of their pay, personal characteristics, the employer, the non-wage income, self-employment income, and this for a lot of periods and how it changes over time, we can really do quite a lot with this. Now, let's consider we could think about wage progression. We could think about the impact of universal credit and benefit reform, labour market equality, distributional impacts, education choices, labour markets, commuting patterns, tax regulation, ex-service personnel, householding, retirement decisions, etc., etc., etc. Essentially, across a lot of government, if you have this sort of information, then every government department is going to have some interest in this. From the Ministry of Transport wanting to know about commuting patterns, the Ministry of Defence wanting to know about what happens to their service personnel, key interest to departments concerned directly with employment and labour, such as BEIS or HMRC. So that is a nice need. How can we actually make this work? Well, let's start off with thinking about our worker. I'm afraid he's a male worker because I can't do skirts in my skip diagrams. Okay, let's imagine that we knew all of the personal characteristics of this person. We also knew quite a lot about their wages, their hour, their industry, where they're working, and possibly about other forms of income, whether they're on pensions, child support. What we'd also like to know for that person is how that's changed over time. What is their work and labour market history? I'd also like to know about where they're working. You know, what types of industries are they working in? What types of companies are they working for? I'd like to know about all their family relationships. You know, if it's a two-adult household, what's the relationship between the employment decisions of those individuals? And I'd like to know about it for everyone in the population. So that's my vision. Seems straightforward enough. As the good thing is that this data does exist somewhere in the UK. All of this information is around and about. The problem is that it's not all in one place. So let's see, where is it? So ONS ASH, the annual survey of hours and earnings, gives you really detailed information on the workplace characteristics of and the employment, the earnings characteristics of an individual. Lots of details on wages and hours, the sort of organisation they're working for, and best of all, we have the same people followed for up to 40 years. So a phenomenal research resource in there. We've also got ONS has business data, so much more information about the businesses. And there is potentially a link between those. Then DWP has a lot of information about, for example, other income sources, and it's also got lots of personal characteristics. HMRC has information on earnings, information on employers, self-employment, information on the whole population. HESA and the Department for Education have more personal characteristics, information on the population, lots of information about relationship between employment and working. And finally, we got the decennial census. So once every 10 years, getting a lot of information about personal characteristics, about about the population, and about family relationships. So all there, but all in multiple different organizations. Now, clearly, if we could build this, this would be a fantastic strategic resource for the country. In other countries, they are building these sorts of linked employer-employee data sets. We don't have it quite here. And this would go much beyond what's being prepared in other countries and make us much more like some of the countries that, for example, have population registers and can directly link all this stuff. We think we could actually build a sustainable framework for this, particularly focusing around the ASH data information on here, because that gives us that spine of individuals who we observe over quite a long time. And so that's what we're going to try and do, but we're going to do this slowly and very slowly because of these information sets here, we haven't got agreement to use all of these yet. So initially, in our first stage of the project, we're going to focus on ONS, ASH data and business data. We're currently working to link together the census data, and we're currently in discussions with the Department for Education about getting educational data in there. So this is phase one of the project, and that's what I'm going to introduce to you today. So we've got funding from ADI UK from end of last year until 2022. And that primarily initially is going to be about quality assuring all the ONS data, linking the ONS data sets, and developing a policy focused research program. I'll come back to those in a moment. But one thing I want to use is we're going to try and take a different way of developing these data resources, what we might think of as a co-production model of working. This is something which is very familiar from the management literature. As an economist, this is something which we don't tend to think of. We tend to think of individuals as sort of individual units. But for management literature, there's quite a different way of looking at the world, and I think this is helpful to consider. Let's think about what we normally think of as the data research policy relationship. I mean, we have data suppliers, organizations such as ONS. They collect vast amounts of data, they make this available to the researchers. Researchers carry out their research, deliver results to the policymakers. And there is a sort of relationship here that data is delivered to the researchers, results are delivered to the policymakers. Now, that's not entirely one way. For example, when ONS reviews its surveys, quite often it will get in touch with the users of the data, the researchers, the policymakers, and ask for input before it goes back and revises its data collection strategy. And of course, researchers don't just dump results down on policymakers. There is a conversation that goes on there. But what we're going to try and do, the co-production model, is trying to change this to make this much deeper relationship. So that when we're thinking about relationship between data suppliers and researchers, it's not primarily one way to the other, that this should be a core part of the relationship, the joint development of the data. And similarly, when we're thinking here about the relationship between policymakers and the researchers, making sure that it's not just we are presenting some information, we found some interesting results, are they of value to you, what's your impact? But very much there is a close relationship between the policymakers and the researchers, and then feeding back to the data suppliers and forward. So we've got this quite deep relationship. So let's look at it from the data side. So the data goals we've got are very specifically in this initial phase one, complete set of ASH data, cleaned, linked by person and job, linked to the employer data. Now that seems in a way why we're doing this, because surely ASH has been around for many years. Ultimately, this data goes back to 1975. I did my PhD in it some 30 years ago. Thing is, from the discussions with ONS, what we know is that there is more information in there. So there's a lot of information about the quality of the data, which is collected, which has not been made available. Think about some information about imputation, about sample stratas. There are also lots of queries about the data. Now, because ASH has been used for such a long time, there is a huge body of knowledge out there. One of our first tasks has been to contact other academics and ask them to provide us with all they know about the issues that are contained within the ASH dataset. And we've collated those, and we're now trying to work these through as a to-do list of trying to find out everything we can about the data. So, for example, there are some variables in the ASH data which the documentation describes in one way, something like the main job variable. Now, that in theory should say this is what someone's main job is, and this is how it's defined. If you compare that data, that variable, with the actual definition of the data, it doesn't match up. So there's about 20% of the cases where the description of the variable doesn't seem to match the actual data that's in there. So there's a huge body of knowledge because this information has been used for so long. So one of our key roles is trying to collate all of this information and put it together and start working through. That's just on the ONS, ASH and BSD datasets, the business structure dataset. But the second part of this phase one is going to be linking to the census 2011 data. Now that is slightly different because as the researchers, we don't get access to the details of the linking process. We never see identified data, for example. We only see the results of the process in a dataset suitable for research use. But how we can contribute to this is being very highly engaged customers. So ONS recently produced or the Statistics Authority recently produced a national statistician's review of best practice in linking. We've worked with some of the authors of that. We've worked with ONS to try and pull together what would be the ideal document such that it gives us as much information as possible about the link between Census 2011 and the ASH data. So we're trying to be highly engaged customers, thinking about us as researchers, what would we want to know as a result of that linking process? But rather than just saying to ONS, this is what we want, we're trying to work through and understand how ONS does the linking process and how what we want fits into their processes such that we got a joint outcome. Moving on to the research goals. I said that this program has been a long time coming. It partly, I suppose, derives from a discussion some of us were having about 5 or 6 years ago, but it really started to coalesce in around 2018, where we looked to some degree at the Administrative Data Research Network, and we knew that that had done some really good things, particularly in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but some of the big goals of that project to link administrative data together hadn't come through. And one of the feelings was that there was a sense that this was very much researcher driven and it didn't engage very much the policy side of things. So back in 2018, we started with very much that diagram I put up at the beginning saying, if we could do this, how would it help government departments? Who would be interested in this? Can we build a coalition of interest such that this would be widely supported across government? We can actually make a difference here. So we started by reviewing all the areas of research interest. We talked to various government departments on here. And we put together a program saying, if we can do this, there is sufficient value in here across government for this to be supported. We have an initial research program. It's been supported by 2 of the smaller government departments, Low Pay Commission and the Government Equalities Office, because those 2 departments were quite closely tied to the initial data plans that we wanted. So the Low Pay Commission, the work that we aim to do with ASH, particularly in building the longitudinal links, is going to be really useful for helping to understand this issue of, are there low pay careers? Are there low paid jobs? Then people move on, or is low pay working an absorbing state? How does it matter over the life cycle? Similarly, for the Government Equalities Office, this ASH census link is going to be really important because you can do the intersectionality of, for example, gender pay gap within the census, but only at a point in time. What you can't do is you can't look at how it changes over time. So those are our initial research priorities. Longer term, we have an academic stakeholder group and a government stakeholder group. I see a number of our members of both of those are here today, so I'm thank you for coming along. Both of those are crucial to the development of the project. The academic stakeholder group, from looking at it from a research perspective, but also these are people who know particularly the ASH data inside out. They've been the source of much of our initial QA of pulling together bits of information. So we've been routing through all of their papers and looking at the information that they've presented and trying to pull that together. The government stakeholder group is at the other end of the chain. What we're trying to do is make sure is that because there are so many potential areas of research that can be carried out here, we're using the government stakeholder group to identify areas of relevant research, to look at potential other data sources being linked together, and to help direct some of the research interests that we have, because otherwise we could go off in many, many different directions. Okay, so that's the broad introduction to the project, and after this I'll stop and ask questions, just to highlight where we're going next. So next, at the end of August, Arusha Mackenzie and Damien Whittard are going to go a little bit more into this whole issue of the quality assurance. The basic question, ASH is 40 years old. Why do we still need to quality assure it? Why do we still need to think about where the data is coming in? So they're going to be exploring some of those issues and talking about some of the things we've done. And then in September, John Forth and Van Fan will be going through and looking at the census linking. Again, we started from an ideal world, but we have to work with institutional constraints. How do we work with this? How do we develop this? And that, I think, is the end. So I'm going to relinquish control from that and take questions.
One of the things that I'm interested in particularly is the ability to see more about more of the workers of those firms. Okay, so the problem is with a 1% sample, you're typically going to get relatively few workers in a given firm. The firm is very large. So I was particularly interested in how you plan to enrich that side of your project. I presume the HMRC data is crucial for that. And I wondered what time scale you're thinking of for that particular thing.
To some extent it is. The difficulty is that there is no one data source that provides all the information. So ASH is fantastic in terms of anything like low pay stuff, in terms of the variables that it has. The big problem is that, as you say, it's only a 1% sample, slightly less than a 1% sample. HMRC data, for example, if we were able to use that, and that's not accessible yet, but that is part of a longer term discussion. HMRC data would be fantastic because it tells you about everyone in the population. The problem is that HMRC, because it's administrative data, is interested in total compensation, and that does give us interesting things like, for example, accommodation offsets for low pay. But in terms of when we're trying to look at are people low paid, it's very difficult to distinguish between those who are low paid on an hourly basis or those who are low paid on a total basis. So one of the things which, as we try to develop this, we're going to have to find ways that using some of the core elements, I think, to calibrate information that we can get from other sources. There's not going to be, ideally, if you can imagine it, we have my camera's on, you can imagine it, we have a square of data, all the people, all the information. What we've got is we've got one line which goes across and one line which goes this way. And we can try and fill in some of the bits and pieces, but it is going to be something that we'll have to essentially use for supporting information rather than complete information about things. So that will, for example, we're hoping that what we're doing here will allow HMRC, for example, to enhance their data resources as well. Because they have their own data labs. So we're hoping to make this as collaborative as possible, and the information that, as we're developing it, will be made available in the Secure Research Service and the other government data sources. So we're hoping the plan for this is to make the data available as far as possible, and maybe someone else can come up with a better solution for some of these things.
Right. So that's great benefits is the hourly earnings, and I understand that that's impossible in the HMRC data, but I'm sort of taking that as a given constraint, and we sort of try and do what we can given that constraint. So, but it sounds to me like the time frame for making that link between, the full employer-employee link, it seems quite long term. Is that correct?
The employer-employee link within the ONS data is sort of straightforward because there is a link. It's just not of the quality that we want at the moment. But again, that links to sample data. So you're linking two samples and the overlap is quite small. Linking to HMRC data, if we can get permission to use it, will be much more straightforward because the sampling criteria, essentially the sample criteria for ASH comes from HMRC, so they will be able to link this information together. So it's not a problem of linking together, it is agreement to do this. And then once we've done that, the fact that we've got two different types of data in the different data sets and how can we use that to make inferences.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. I see Hazel's got your hand up. Hazel?
Yeah. From a researcher's perspective, I think this looks amazing, especially somebody who researches equal pay. I mean, what you could do with this data would be fantastic. With my research governance hat on and now research ethics hat on as well, I think it looks a bit like a GDPR nightmare because as you start to relate all this data together, then of course it stops being non-personally identifiable data. It's much more, it'd be much easier to identify individuals in that data. So I was wondering if you'd kind of thought of any ways around that? I mean, you've talked about the secure data service.
Yeah.
Is that part of the answer to this problem?
That's the essential part of the answer. So we as researchers don't get any access to any identified information. So all the linking is taken place by other government departments, and ONS has set up its own extra secure research facilities. They do the stuff, and then we get to compare the results. In terms of the actual analysis, then we get access to identifiable data. In other words, the data is potentially, you could try and look at that and try and see whether you could identify your neighbor or your mother or something in the data set. But because it's identifiable, then it's only accessible through the Secure Research Service. So to get that, you need to be an accredited researcher. You need to have gone through the training. You can only access it through the remote facility where everything that you do is monitored. So everything, when using a research service, everything is recorded, your entire session, so that if you do something wrong, if proof is in front of you. There's quite a wide sort of group of work around this. There's also a research accreditation panel, which goes through and approves all the applications. And there's also output checking, so to make sure that all of the results that you produce from here are non-disclosive. So pretty much, if those of you are familiar with the 5 safes, then there is research accreditation for looking at the project. There is the researcher accreditation. The Secure Research Service itself has been validated against the Digital Economy Act. The outputs have been validated. And that's why you can have this relatively sensitive, identifiable data in that secure facility, because you locked down everything else.
Okay. Does that answer the questions around consent, though? I guess that people who consented to take part in ONS and ASH data didn't.
These are not, no, there is a different statutory gateway for access to consent on here, but that's part of what the Research Accreditation Panel looks at. And then as part of this, you also have the government, I can't remember what it's called, National Statistics Ethics Committee looks at this. So yeah, and you can only use this for what you've approved it to be done. So when, for example, we work on the data, when we ask for outputs to be released, then the ONS output checking team will look at the outputs we've asked and say, this is what you said you're going to look at. This is what you've actually produced. Are they actually in line with the project as you proposed? So because it's a statutory gateway rather than consent-based gateway, there's a lot of checks to make sure that what we're doing is ethical, approved by the public, and that we don't try to push the boundaries on that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay, well, as we're perfectly on time, thanks to our 2 questioners, then I'm going to finish up with that. I say this is going to be the aim of these sessions, relatively short, sweet, hopefully give you some useful information, chance to come back on this. We will put this recording up on the website, and feel free to sign up for the next one if this has been useful. Alternatively, if it's not been useful, please let us know and tell us how we might make it more useful in future. Okay, right. Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.